All right, hello, this is the submittal for Group 16's Compendium project. Our concept is two-eyed seeing. Myself, Ryder, and Jordan are here, and we're joined with Jordan. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, for sure. My name is Jordan Quintafio. I am co-chair of the Indigenous Design and Planning Students Association, along with Danielle Desarlet, who she wasn't able to be here today. But yeah, if we just want to dive into the questions.
For sure, yeah. Our first question, which we had for you, was about, sorry, I'm just pulling that up. Before conducting our research, our group didn't know much about the concept of two-eyed seeing, and we wanted to ask you, why do you think this topic isn't talked about often, and how do you believe that we could make the topic more known?
Yeah, so I mean, there isn't really a reason why your group or you guys would have heard about two-eyed seeing just in like a mainstream public context. You know, you would probably have to actively seek an alternative view, other than how curriculums are taught in academic environments right now. Secondly, it's most likely because it's not broadcasted in academic environments because it doesn't necessarily align with a prototypical Western thought of academia, in the sense that it challenges norms that have been ingrained into a society that is predominantly white colonial, especially in the Canadian context. You know, additionally, aside from that, there's, I wouldn't say resistance, but let's say resistance for now, from both the Western colonial academics for the reason I just mentioned, but also from Indigenous peoples towards concepts in general, but also the concept of two-eyed seeing, just because essentially not everyone has adopted that kind of thought. You probably also haven't heard of it too, because as a Micmac concept of education, like Indigenous voices in academia haven't been well represented for quite some time. Yeah, and then I think the follow-up question was, how do you believe we could raise awareness of the term? If you believe two-eyed seeing is a thinking process that you believe is worth raising awareness to, you could raise awareness of the concept by well, applying it to your own thoughts and thinking critically of the curriculums and environments around you. And by sharing, so now you have knowledge of two-eyed seeing. By sharing that knowledge and your thoughts towards it with other people, conversations and debates typically take place, but it altogether raises awareness of potential issues that are accepted as the status quo, and it allows others to begin thinking critically as well. It is important to recognize that two-eyed seeing is not a universal thought process that is accepted among all Indigenous peoples, or Micmac peoples for that matter. But two-eyed seeing is not necessarily the answer to all Indigenous representation in education.
Okay, thank you. I will pass it on to Jordan for question 2.
Yeah, so you did touch about it often, but we kind of just wanted some more clarity of why you think two-eyed seeing isn't as seen in like the academic proposals, and especially in like architecture and environmental design. Like, why do you think that it's not as relevant in like architecture?
Well, I would say in design in general, because it wouldn't just be architecture, it'd be, you know, architecture, landscape architecture, interior design, city planning. But it's it's not a regularly occurring topic in project proposals, both in an academic environment and a professional environment. I've worked in a professional office before, so I'm speaking from that experience as well. Like, although there might be terms or ideas or concepts that are similar in nature to attempting to be inclusive or collaborative of different backgrounds of thought, it's not often discussed because two-eyed seeing isn't an extremely well-known concept among other people or the design community. Two-eyed seeing might be even more recognized in like more of like a social work context, or some of those areas, but it's not universally accepted. In the professional world too, challenging the status quo, which is that of the Western colonial view, can often be seen as a risk, as silly as it sounds. Clients or other participants in the design team, and the design team, that means like including contractors, might not be interested in trying to adopt different views. It's different views or challenging the status quo is often met with concerns of more work, more time, and more money involved, which isn't necessarily true, but that's how it's often perceived.
All right, our next question was about what benefits can result when
specifically or in itself will bring benefits to the future of design, but the underlying foundation of it as a concept of inclusivity and collaboration will be and has been beneficial to the design world. We haven't even touched on like the tip of the iceberg in regards to collaboration and inclusivity in the professional and academic world, but it is beginning to change. Like, for example, when I was in your year and in ED2, Indigenous thought or Indigenous design principles or anything like that wasn't even talked about. So it has changed quite a bit. There isn't any predetermined singular method for design to benefit from two-eyed seeing or Indigenous thought, but inclusiveness of Indigenous thought is what we believe beneficial to the future of design because of our inherent connection to the land. And that's whether you're in architecture or landscape architecture or interior design. Danielle's in architecture and I'm in landscape architecture. But that exists in either field. It's more of a way of life, really. We know that the land is the greatest teacher. You know, it has shown us what is harmful and what is good for her. She has shown us when to intervene and when it's best to be left alone. And the land, or what Westerners would refer to as the natural world, will tell you, it'll tell you all you need to know in order to design our environments, essentially. But like in talking about the land and learning from the land, it's also just, it's not done in the same way through a Western way of studying in kind of this extractive academic manner. Indigenous knowledge is contextual, it's engaging, observational, and performative. Indigenous knowledge and thought is distinct because our relationship with the environment, or as Stephanie Nohelini said, it's essential to the aspect of social organization and into intellectual development for Indigenous peoples. The land operates in an interdependent, cyclical manner, and that you can think of that in the way of ecology, where everything affects one another. And if we apply this to how we build and design our environments, we may have a chance at achieving a sustainable cohabitation with the earth, which is something that Indigenous peoples have been doing for millennia.
Jordan, did you want to take on another question?
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking of what he said about like Indigenous practices being engaging. That was really thought-provoking for me. And that kind of ties in, I guess, with our fourth question of like, how can we incorporate like the land-based learning or like two-eyed seeing into public spaces, like with schools or hospitals, if that could benefit them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in way of the Faculty of Architecture, like ADIPSA and some of our partners, some professors, we've been working on like kind of answering that in way of how we learn from the land through a university. So I don't think I'm publicly allowed to say this yet. So there is something coming up that we'll be announcing I think in the coming weeks, but on Faculty of Architecture aside, I think just like I believe having a level of understanding that a Western colonial way or thought process isn't the only one that exists. And I'm not even just talking about alternatives as Indigenous thought, but any other culture's thought. And Western colonial thought is definitely not always the right one. Considering that there are other ways to conduct aspects of life, other ways to look at teaching, health, you know, when you're talking about this project at the hospital, you know, an Indigenous view of how health is treated is very different. Even socialization and how we treat and view our environments, how we live our daily lives, listening to other people's perspectives can help grow our perspectives, even if we don't necessarily agree with them. And I think that like two-eyed seeing right now, as we're talking about it in certain social and political contexts of what's going on right now in terms of divisiveness is also really interesting. Like recently I overheard a quote from Tim McAuliffe, who's like, he's a sports broadcaster. So I was surprised, I just kind of overheard it in the background, but he was talking about the dying art of disagreement, and how it's a terrible experiment right now, like how we can disagree with someone and still give them space to say their piece and express their thoughts without compromising our own opinion. More people need to understand that aspect of it and just have conversations with people, which is, I think, fits nicely into this idea of two-eyed seeing.
Okay, thank you. Our next question delves into the challenges that are faced when combining Western knowledge and Indigenous culture, and how these challenges can be resolved.
Yeah, many challenges, but you know, not challenges that can't be overcome. A primary issue when you're combining Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge is that Western academics often try to delegitimize Indigenous knowledge because, well, it's different from their own. But also the premise, like where the knowledge is rooted in, is different. It's not the same thing. So Indigenous knowledge is rooted in the land, and it's place-based knowledge versus, equations and scientific and mathematical knowledge. Not that Indigenous people don't practice, mathematical knowledge or anything, but it's just a different way of looking at the world. It makes Indigenous knowledge sound primal, but it doesn't make it less worthy or legitimate. It's just different. Indigenous knowledge can't be measured by the same tools Westerners use to measure knowledge. So it appears to fall short or less intelligent. Like the premise of Indigenous knowledge is through observing the land, understanding its relationships between all living things, seeing the land as a living being. So, for example, like addressing something as a person, as a being. So like a tree, it's not it's not a thing. It's a living being. And, some trees are female and male as well, like scientifically in the sense of the word. So addressing them as she or he, versus what a Westerner would kind of approach that as like a thing, or like addressing something as an object. A tree is a thing, a rock is a thing. It's not a living being or whatever. Indigenous knowledge isn't rooted in that all things are equal as well, like in order for a cyclical balance to take place. Whereas Western thought is rooted in a human-centered world where humans find themselves at the top of this hierarchical pyramid. Carl Kuhlman, he has some really interesting literature on the landscape of things and how we kind of got to the point of calling objects or things or trees or landscapes things. So I can refer you to his literature after, but Indigenous thought is believed to be also like not rational, because it's not measured as legitimate in the same fashion as Western thought, which is kind of what I said before. So when Indigenous thought is considered, it's considered within the boundaries or spheres of what is legible and measurable in Western academics and not in Indigenous academics. Indigenous knowledge is usually considered to be like a metaphysical or spiritual thing, and that means that it lacks rational thought. Even though Western, academics have also been based in mythology, Greek mythology, and a lot of Western religions are based in these kind of metaphysical things. Sarah Hunt, who is also a really good, she has some great literature. She said that the establishment of boundaries of meaning, or the creation of categories in order for Indigenous knowledge to be legible, it has to adhere to these Western recognized forms of representation, or else it's seen as illegitimate. Yeah, I mean, this is a big question. This one was one that I had to reflect on a little bit more. Also when you're combining two very different backgrounds of thought, there's also the history behind, colonialism and in Indigenous peoples. So that's always in the back of when you're collaborating these things. You have a lot of history in terms of Indigenous people trying to gain sovereignty to actually practice those Indigenous ways of life or thought. So you run into an issue where you know, on paper, two-eyed seeing might be seen as like a 50-50, like a perfect balance of like, oh, we're going to take 50% of this and 50% of this and combine them and it'll be great. But in real life, that's not guaranteed to be the case. Knowledge from the Indigenous side is often considered as the other view to supplement the Western view. And, you know, sometimes that can be evident in the phrase of consulting Indigenous views to assure that due diligence has occurred and inclusion and collaboration can be declared, and it's all rainbows and butterflies. But alternatively, the Indigenous person may be perceived as the people that require assistance in their knowledge, as theirs is not seen as rational or legitimate, again, and requires Western thought to supplement and make their thought rational. Michael Anthony Hart, another really great author, said that, you know, like when a professor describes the world that they live in, they describe it in like a Eurocentric context and ignore Indigenous perspectives and understandings. Eurocentric thought has come to mediate the entire world to the point where worldviews that differ from, you know, the Western Eurocentric thought are, you know, relegated to the periphery if they are acknowledged at all. And when they're acknowledged, Indigenous worldviews are analyzed most often through a Eurocentric point of view. Even Brooke kind of said, like, you know, like the mainstream way of thinking, which would be a Eurocentric kind of way of thinking, you know, you would all see a world through that lens, because that's you wouldn't know any differently. But you know, even when professors are talking about the world in class, they're coming from that lens as well. So there's so many challenges, but all things that can be addressed. Sorry, that was really long. It's kind of rambling.
No, that was awesome. That was actually super inspirational to me. It helps me understand. You know, through our research, we found that a lot of times Indigenous knowledge seemed to come second to Western science. So with your answer, I feel like we can now find ways to kind of work towards making Indigenous knowledge more accepted. And instead of being secondary to Western science, they can work together.
Yeah.
I will toss it to Jordan for the last question.
Yeah, our last question is just about like well, the elder Albert Marshall, he's known for coining the term two-eyed seeing. And we were wondering if you knew any like other notable people who helped popularize the term, or even someone local who has used it.
You know what? I don't think so, really. You know, even in a lot of literature that I've read, I find that I haven't come across two-eyed seeing specifically. I may have come across, like, again, similar like concepts or ideas that are based on collaboration or inclusiveness, but not specifically two-eyed seeing, no.
All right, well, thank you so much. It was great to be able to speak with someone who could answer our questions about these things and the philosophy behind two-eyed seeing. Again, our group didn't really know much before the research, so it's been great to speak with someone, you know, kind of face-to-face, as most face-to-face as we can get in the COVID world. But yeah, thank you. That was super insightful, and we'll be able to apply that to our research now.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Just, you know, let me know if you guys have any other questions after. Just feel free to email me. Brooke, you can, you know, give my email to the others. Yeah, if you have any questions after your reflections, just let me know. And good luck with your project.
Thank you. Take care.